bunch of different bands, from metal to funk to fusion to jazz. So I'll play a mash of everything for you.
And welcome to episode 4 of the Quarantine Fest 2020. Okay, so this one time, we left off in the last episode with my cat pooping in the middle of a story. So we had to shut down production because it just wasn't going to go on. Yes, there is more to say about Beat It. There's such legendary stories around that song and the solo. The way I heard it is Quincy Jones called up Eddie Van Halen to do a solo. And Eddie was out by the pool and his phone wasn't working all that great. Plus he tended to get prank calls from anybody that got his number because he was so huge at the time. And he just picked up the phone and couldn't hear anybody on the other end, so he hung up. And that happened 2 or 3 times before Quincy was finally able to get through and say, "Hey, Eddie, it's Q. I want you to come and play a solo on this record I'm doing." And Eddie agreed and went down and carved out a couple solos that they comped together. And he did it for free because Van Halen had a pact at the time. The band had a pact that none of them would work on other projects. It would only be Van Halen. And he thought, everybody else is on vacation. Who's gonna know? People found out. When I played that solo with my cover band, starting, I think, 1984, 85, it always felt so great. I just loved the soul in that solo. It's just everything was supreme and perfect. And when I played it with Michael, it just didn't feel that good. And I thought, well, maybe it's because of the pressure of playing for 50 or 60,000 people. A minute before my solo came up, my heart would start pounding a little louder, because that was my big deal in the show. And about a month or 2 into the first tour, I got a hold of a cassette tape and listened to it and realized we were playing it so much faster than the record. That's why it didn't feel right. And I promise you, if the original Beat It had been at the speed that we played it live, Eddie would have done a completely different solo. On the Bad tour, I had a costume that was leather. It was a one-piece costume, and I had these fiber optic laser lights that were connected to a hat that they would strap on me just before I would go out for that song. And the laser fibers were connected and went like half a mile to a computer operator that controlled the lights, and the lights would change as I moved. One of the things about Beat It that was a bit of a challenge is I was playing standard guitar strings all night long, maybe 9 to 42 gauge, and for Beat It, we took it down to C. So 2 whole steps below concert pitch. And so I had a guitar set up with really heavy strings for that. When you're used to a certain gauge and you're used to bending a certain amount to get a certain pitch, all of a sudden you have a Frankenstein guitar and it's a little bit of an extra challenge. And he did change keys in a few things. Like I remember at rehearsals when we did Thriller, there was a period of 2 or 3 days where every day we would get word that he wanted to try it in a different key. In part because he had to compensate for all the energy he was putting out in dancing. That takes a lot of oxygen. So to match the pitch that he did on the record, it was tough. So bringing the pitch down helped him out. Okay, so this one time, we opened up in Europe, in Rome, on the Bad tour. And it was in the middle of the summer, so there were no blackouts. You couldn't possibly do a blackout because we were playing outdoors and it was still light till very, very late. And so I did not have the fiber optic headdress that I had had in the arenas in America, indoors or indoors in Japan. I was having some trouble with noise in my system at sound check. But we ran through sound check and the tech went to work on it. And what he did, nobody should ever do. Because in essence, he turned down the volume on my wireless system, which in essence was kind of like turning the volume on the guitar to half and trying to compensate by turning the volume up elsewhere. And so when I went out to do that solo with no headdress in the light of day, I had such a weenie tone. It was all I could do to get through that solo. It was horrifying. And of course, I didn't know that that was going to happen because it was only on that one guitar until I was out in front of 50 or 60,000 people. It was kind of like doing the Beat It solo on an acoustic guitar. I was trying to get the tapping and the harmonics to pop out. It was bullet to the head time. You live and hopefully you learn. The rehearsals were so intense for the Bad Tour. The first part of it was that the band was in one room rehearsing by ourselves. Singers were in one room working together, and the dancers were in another room. The second month, everybody got together on a big sound stage so we could do the special effects and the pyro and choreography and work out the stage moves. So by the time we got to Japan, that show was so nailed. I think we were working 7 days a week by the time we took off. And the rehearsals were so long, the hours per day, that I actually hired a buddy of mine to drive my dog back to San Diego because I was gone all the time. And during all those rehearsals, nobody told me I had the gig. As far as I knew, it was still just play with the band and see how it goes. And so I kept it secret. I kept subbing out all my teaching and all my other gigs. And day by day, it's like, still can't make it. And eventually, I got a passport and a ticket to Tokyo. So I thought, that sounded pretty good. The Bad Tour opened in Japan, and we were there for about 3 weeks. We did a lot of shows there. And at one point, Michael shut down the Tokyo Disneyland so we could hang out without the public. We were so spoiled. And his movie Captain EO had recently come out. So we all got to see it as a group, which was a real thrill. Super 3D innovative filming. And at one point, I ended up in a gift shop with Sheryl Crow because she was one of the background singers. And we were hanging out looking at this Daffy Duck toothbrush holder. These are the things I spend my money on. Just goofy stuff. And you would take Daffy's head and push it down, and the eyes would go back and forth for as long as you were supposed to brush your teeth. And I was just fascinated. Cheryl and I were just pushing the head down, just going, wow, this is so cool. All of a sudden, Michael tapped me on the back of the shoulder and said, hey, I really like how you're doing the Beat It solo. That's when I took a deep breath and realized I really did have the gig. One of the really fun things that we did in Japan was we all ended up in Nelson Hayes' room. And there was a big promotional video that was on Japanese TV. So we all gathered together and watched it live. That was a lot of footage of Michael and the Jackson 5 early days. And it was just such an exciting thing that just burned in my brain like, hey, I am part of this and I am having a blast. Okay, so this one time, on the Dangerous tour, we were rehearsing as a band next door to Spinal Tap one day. And I really wanted to go next door during a break and get an autograph on my guitar from Nigel Tufnell. Who wouldn't, right? So I did. I went over there, and lo and behold, he asked me to sit in with them at the Universal Ampitheatre. So you just don't turn that down, even when you're rehearsing with Michael Jackson, if you're me. I was happy to get my autograph by Nigel Tufnell. And years later, when I met Jeff Beck for the first time, I wanted him to sign my guitar. And he saw Nigel's signature, and he drew an air pocket between the two of them with little dots in it. So he didn't want to be too close to Nigel. For those that don't know, Nigel got his whole shtick for Spinal Tap from Jeff. And Jeff said when he first met Nigel, Nigel reached into his pocket and gave him all his change and said, "Here, I owe you this." Once we all got together as the band singers and dancers, day after day, Michael wasn't showing up. We were still rehearsing, but he wasn't showing up. And so I took a chance that I was just going to go play with Spinal Tap. And of course, as Murphy's Law would have it, that's the day Michael showed up and wanted to know where the hell I was. I don't know what they told him, but Eddie Garcia, the dancer, took my place and beat it and did the moves and walked along the stage with Michael. And luckily, I didn't get fired. So I went off and played with Spinal Tap on a track called Break Lock the Wind, the title track of their newest album at the time. Steve Lukather played on that track, and Debbie Peterson from the Bangles played drums. The concert was, of course, really fun and wild and crazy. Oh, dude, you really got to chase flies at this point. The craziest thing about playing with Spinal Tap is the drummer broke his foot between sound check and the show. And nobody believes me when I tell them that story, because in Spinal Tap, if you know the movie, there's always something bad that happens to the drummers, like death. He really broke his foot, but he really wanted to play the show. And I believe he played about half of it, and they got Chad Wackerman to sit in and play the rest of the show. So it went off without a hitch, but just the fact that that happened is kind of spooky and crazy at the same time. And I reconnected with the guys from Spinal Tap years later when I was with Jeff Beck. They flew into London to do a premiere for the Mighty Wind movie that they had just done. It was Christopher Guest and Michael McKean, and it was so cool to see the movie. And then they did a Q&A afterwards where they explained, and this blew my mind, that there's really no script for his movies. There's just kind of an outline, and he always gets people that can just improvise. So he will take 100 hours of film that he has shot and edit it down to 90 minutes of the funniest stuff, and that's the movie. That's just how he does it.